The car didn't just hit the wall, it was torn in half. Lap 1, turn 1, 1995. Millions froze in horror as Stan Fox slid down the track at 200 miles per hour with his legs dangling in the open air. No safety cell, no protection, just flesh against asphalt. It was the most horrifying crash in IndyCar history. Everyone thought he was dead, but he survived. A true miracle. But the ending, that is the most terrifying part. 5 years later, the man who walked away from that hell died in a simple, ordinary van crash on a quiet road. He beat death on the racetrack, but he lost on the way home. Stan Fox was not manufactured in a corporate laboratory. Today's racing drivers often come from a lineage of wealth, groomed from the age of 5 in high-end karting academies, media trained to say the right things to sponsors. Fox was the antithesis of this. Born in Janesville, Wisconsin on July 7, 1952, he was a product of the American heartland, a place where racing wasn't a path to fame, but a blue-collar trade, like plumbing or welding, only louder and more likely to kill you. Janesville in the 1950s and 60s was an industrial hub dominated by the massive General Motors assembly plant. It was a town of hard work, heavy machinery, and shifting gears. It was in this environment that Fox developed a mechanical sympathy and a roughness that would define his driving style. He didn't view the car as a delicate instrument. He viewed it as a tool to be hammered. He didn't start in the pristine world of Formula cars. He started where the real education happened, the midgets. For the uninitiated, the term midget car sounds diminutive, almost cute. In reality, a midget is one of the most terrifying vehicles ever conceived. It is essentially a 4-cylinder engine with 4 wheels and a roll cage bolted directly to it. There is no transmission, no starter motor, and virtually no suspension travel. They weigh roughly 900 pounds but produce anywhere from 300 to 400 horsepower. The power-to-weight ratio of a midget in the 1970s was staggering, but the real challenge was the wheelbase. Because the car is so short, barely 6 feet between the axles, it is inherently unstable. It wants to spin. It wants to flip. To drive a midget fast, you cannot be smooth. You have to wrestle it. You have to throw it into a corner sideways, pitching it into a drift at 100 miles per hour on loose dirt, using the throttle to steer the rear wheels while counter-steering with the front. It is a violent physical act. This was Stan Fox's classroom. In 1972, at the age of 20, Fox began his campaign. He didn't explode onto the scene with the polish of a prodigy. He arrived with the stubbornness of a brawler. He cut his teeth at Angel Park Speedway in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin. Angel Park is the Wrigley Field of midget racing, a historic, unforgiving clay oval that has broken more bones than it has made stars. The culture of Wisconsin short track racing in the 1970s was wild. It was an era of open-face helmets and T-shirts in the pits. The drivers were characters, men with nicknames like the Gas Man or Leadfoot. They raced 3, sometimes 4 nights a week. They hauled their own cars on open trailers behind beat-up pickup trucks, sleeping in the cabs, living on fast food and adrenaline. Fox fit this world like a glove. He was short, stocky, and possessed a distinct look that would become his trademark, the flat-top haircut. While the rest of the world moved into the shaggy hair of the disco era and later the mullets of the 80s, Fox kept his hair buzzed into a military-style flat top. It made him look serious, almost severe. It made him look like a man who didn't have time for fashion because he was too busy going fast. By the mid-1970s, it became clear that Fox possessed something that couldn't be taught. In racing circles, they call it the internal gyroscope. It's the ability to feel the limit of traction before the car actually slides. But Fox had something else, a complete lack of self-preservation instinct when the helmet went on. His driving style was often described as stand on it. In midget racing, when you enter a corner on dirt, the car slides. If you lift off the gas, the weight transfers forward. The rear grips up and the car can snap roll, a violent cartwheel that sends cars flying over the catch fence. The safest way to get through a trouble spot in a midget is, counterintuitively, to stay on the gas. You have to power through the slide. Fox was a master of this. He drove deeply into corners, far past the braking markers of his competitors, and pitched the cars sideways with aggressive brutality. He was a rim rider, often putting his right rear tire inches from the wooden retaining wall, finding the cushion of loose dirt that built up there to launch himself down the straightaway. In 1979, the hard work paid off. Fox captured the Badger Midget Auto Racing Association title. This was not a minor local trophy. The Badger Midget Series is the oldest sanctioning body in the sport. To win that title meant you had beaten the best dirt specialists in the country. It was a seal of approval. It said, Stan Fox is for real. But the 1970s were just the prologue. The 1980s would see Stan Fox become a legend of the outlaw circuit. As the 1980s dawned, the American racing landscape was changing. The Indianapolis 500 was becoming more corporate, more international. But down on the grassroots level, the midget and sprint car scenes were entering a golden age. Fox was no longer just a Wisconsin hero. He was becoming a national threat. He began traveling extensively, chasing the biggest purses in the country. This nomadic lifestyle hardened him. He wasn't racing for points, he was racing for rent money. This distinction is crucial. When a driver races for a championship, they might settle for second place to protect their points lead. When a driver races for dinner, second place is the first loser. Fox raced for dinner. Two venues defined his prowess during this era: the Copper World Classic in Phoenix and the Belleville High Banks in Kansas. The Belleville High Banks is known as the world's fastest half-mile dirt track. It is a bowl of terror, a circular track with banking so steep that it's difficult to walk up. The speeds in a midget at Belleville are frightening. To win there requires a special kind of bravery. Fox didn't just win there, he owned it. He won the prestigious Belleville Midget Nationals, solidifying his reputation as a gasser, a driver who would hold the throttle wide open, even when common sense screamed to lift. It was during these years that Fox built his relationship with the mechanics and car owners who adored him. He wasn't a diva. He didn't complain about the setup. If the car was loose, he drove it loose. If it was tight, he muscled it. He was known for hopping out of a car covered in mud, his face caked in dirt except for the white circles around his eyes where the goggles had been, lighting a cigarette and laughing about a near-death experience in Turn 3. He collected USAC victories like baseball cards. 19 times he stood in victory lane for a USAC National Midget feature. But despite his dominance on the dirt, there was a glass ceiling. In the hierarchy of American racing, midget drivers were often seen as specialists. The big teams at the Indy 500, Penske, Newman/Haas, Patrick Racing, were looking for drivers with road racing experience, guys who understood aerodynamics and telemetry. They weren't looking for a short, flat-topped guy from Wisconsin who specialized in sliding a 900-pound buggy through the mud. Stan Fox was in danger of becoming a lifer, a legend of the short tracks who never got a shot at the big time. He was approaching his mid-30s. In racing years, the clock was ticking. The path from the dirt bull rings to the polished asphalt of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was becoming narrower every year. The transition from a midget to an IndyCar is arguably the most difficult jump in motorsports. A midget has no downforce, it relies on mechanical grip, the tires touching the dirt. An IndyCar is an upside-down airplane. It relies on aerodynamic grip. The faster you go in an IndyCar, the more the air pushes you down and the more grip you have. To drive an IndyCar fast, you have to trust the air. You have to drive into a corner at 220 miles per hour, knowing that if you slow down, you actually lose grip. For a dirt tracker like Fox, this is completely counterintuitive. On dirt, if you're scared, you slow down. In an IndyCar, if you slow down too much, the downforce evaporates and you crash. In 1984, the door cracked open. Fox began dabbling in bigger machinery. He started running Silver Crown cars, big, brutish dirt cars that were essentially stretched midgets with massive V8 engines. But the real target was the Speedway. Fox's entry into the IndyCar world wasn't through a red carpet. It was through the side door. He didn't have a multi-million-dollar sponsor like Marlboro or Budweiser. He had local businessmen, friends, and small associates piecing together funding. This meant he wasn't testing in the off-season. He wasn't spending hours in wind tunnels. He was showing up in May, jumping into a car that was often a year or two old, and trying to qualify against the fastest drivers in the world. And yet the internal gyroscope didn't fail him. When Stan Fox arrived at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway for rookie orientation, the skeptics were lined up. They saw a dirt track brawler. They expected him to be overwhelmed by the speed, by the complexity of the machines, by the sheer magnitude of the event. They were wrong. Fox approached Indy with the same workmanlike attitude he applied to the dirt tracks of Janesville. He listened, he learned, and most importantly, he was fast. He discovered that the same sensitivity that allowed him to feel the cushion of dirt at Angel Park allowed him to feel the subtle changes in balance of an IndyCar at 200 miles per hour. He wasn't fighting the car, he was negotiating with it. By 1987, the dream became reality. Stan Fox qualified for his first Indianapolis 500. He was driving for A.J. Foyt, the legend himself. To drive for Foyt is a trial by fire. Foyt did not suffer fools. If you were slow or if you complained, you were gone. The fact that A.J. Foyt, arguably the greatest American race car driver of all time, put Stan Fox in his car spoke volumes. It was a nod of respect from one gladiator to another. In that 1987 race, Fox didn't just participate, he performed. He started 26th and clawed his way through the field to finish 7th. It was a masterclass in patience and survival. In a race of attrition, where engines blew and superstars crashed, the rookie from the dirt tracks brought the car home. Suddenly, Stan Fox wasn't just a midget driver anymore. He was an Indy 500 driver. For the next 8 years, Fox lived a double life. For 11 months of the year, he was still Stan the midget racer, touring the small tracks, hanging out in the dusty pits, accessible and grounded. But every May, he would travel to Indianapolis, don the fireproof suit of a professional Indy car driver, and step into the spotlight. He became a fan favorite at the Speedway. The fans loved him because he looked like them. He wasn't a sleek European with an unpronounceable name. He was Stan. He was the guy you could imagine having a beer with. He represented the little guy, the small teams fighting against the giants of Penske and Ganassi. Between 1987 and 1995, Fox started the Indy 508 consecutive times. This consistency is remarkable. To qualify for Indy once is a lifetime achievement. To do it 8 years in a row, often with underfunded teams and older equipment, proved that Fox was an elite talent. He earned the nickname Stan the Man. But as the 1990s progressed, the cars were changing. They were becoming faster, lighter, and more fragile. The use of carbon fiber was allowing for incredible speeds, but the designs were pushing the boundaries of physics. The noses of the cars were getting narrower to penetrate the air more efficiently. The driver's feet were being pushed further forward, closer to the front of the car, in the pursuit of aerodynamics. The sport was becoming a high-wire act. The margin for error was vanishing. And unbeknownst to Fox, the geometry of disaster was being drawn. In the garages of the chassis manufacturers, engineers were celebrating the new levels of downforce. They were shaving ounces off the bulkheads. They were making the cars needle-nosed missiles. They were designing for speed, assuming that the carbon fiber would hold up in a crash. They were wrong, and Stan Fox was about to become the proof. As May 1995 approached, Fox was 42 years old. He was a veteran. He had nothing left to prove. He had mastered the dirt. He had tamed the speedway. He was driving for Ron Hemmelgarn, a team owner who believed in him. The number 91 Delta Fawcett Renard Ford was painted a brilliant purple and orange. It was a fast car. It looked like a contender. Fox felt good. The month of practice had gone well. The car was handling beautifully. He qualified 11th, a fantastic starting position, right in the thick of the action. The stage was set. The sun rose on race day, May 28, 1995, bathing the track in golden light. The atmosphere was electric. But in the grandstands and in the pits, no one could see the invisible threads of fate tightening. No one knew that this would be the last time the old Stan Fox, the fearless, sharp-witted king of the midgets, would ever be seen whole again. The engines fired, the field rolled away, and the countdown to the end of an era began. Stan Fox, sitting in the cockpit of the number 91 Hemmelgarn Racing Renard, was insulated from the politics, but he was not immune to the pressure. He was starting on the inside of row 4. Ahead of him were legends: Scott Goodyear, Arie Luyendyk, Jacques Villeneuve. Behind him were hungry young wolves. Fox adjusted his gloves. He tightened his harness until it bruised his collarbones. The ritual of strapping into an IndyCar is claustrophobic. You are essentially lying on your back, feet raised high, encased in a carbon fiber tub that fits tighter than a tailored suit. Your field of vision is a narrow slit. The vibration of the 800 horsepower Ford Cosworth XB engine behind your head rattles your teeth even at idle. At 11 a.m., the command was given. Ladies and gentlemen, start your engines. 33 methanol-fueled monsters roared to life. The sound of an IndyCar field firing up is not a noise. It is a physical sensation. It resonates in the chest cavity. The smell of unburnt fuel, sweet, sharp, and toxic, flooded the pit lane. Fox rolled off. The parade laps were a blur of waving fans, but his mind was already in turn 1. The warm-up laps are crucial. You weave the car, scrubbing the slick Firestone tires against the asphalt to generate heat. Cold tires are ice skates. You need heat for grip. You need grip to survive. As the pace car pulled into the pit lane, the field formed into the famous row of 3 formation. It is a spectacle unique to Indy. 11 rows, 3 cars wide, accelerating toward a funnel at 230 miles per hour. The green flag waved. The roar was deafening, and Stan Fox accelerated toward his destiny. Turn 1 at Indianapolis is not really a turn. It is a geographic feature. It is a quarter mile of asphalt, banked at 9 degrees, inside a stadium of concrete and steel. On the first lap of the Indianapolis 500, Turn 1 is the most dangerous place on Earth. You have 33 cars, heavy with 40 gallons of fuel, on tires that are not yet fully up to temperature, all fighting for the same piece of real estate. The air is turbulent, churning off the rear wings of the lead cars, creating pockets of vacuum and instability for the cars behind. As the field screamed down the front straightaway, speeds topped 220 miles per hour. Stan Fox was positioned low on the track. To his right, slightly ahead, was Eddie Cheever. The start seemed clean. The front rows swept through the corner, but as the mid-pack arrived at the entrance of the turn, physics decided to intervene. Fox entered the short chute, the brief straight before the turn-in point. He was low. Too low? Perhaps. But the real enemy was the air. As he approached the corner, the aerodynamic wake from the cars ahead washed over his front wing. In an Indy car, the front wing is what plants the nose to the ground. If you lose airflow over the front wing, you lose steering. It's called understeer, or push. You turn the wheel, but the car continues straight. At that moment, Fox's car drifted up the track. It was a subtle movement at first, a drift of maybe 2 or 3 feet. But at 200 miles per hour, 3 feet is the difference between a racing line and a disaster zone. His front right wheel made contact with the left rear of Eddie Cheever's car. In open-wheel racing, tire-to-tire contact is the worst-case scenario. Tires are spinning rubber saws. When they touch, they don't rub, they launch. The rotation of Cheever's wheel grabbed Fox's wheel and catapulted the nose of Fox's car into the air. Fox's car didn't just spin, it became a projectile. It rotated 90 degrees to the direction of travel. He was no longer driving. He was a passenger in a ballistic missile. The car slid across the track, aimed directly at the outside retaining wall. The crash that followed happened in less than a second, but forensic engineers would spend years analyzing it. Most crashes at Indy involve a car hitting the wall at an angle. The car scrapes along the concrete, shedding parts, which dissipates energy. It's violent, but the time duration of the crash spreads the G-forces out. Stan Fox did not hit at a glancing angle. He hit nearly head-on. The nose of the purple Renard struck the concrete wall. The angle of impact was brutal, but the real horror lay in how the car failed. An IndyCar chassis is designed to crush. The nose cone is a sacrificial structure, a honeycomb of carbon and aluminum meant to crumple like an accordion, absorbing the kinetic energy so the driver doesn't have to. It is the crumple zone. But on this day, the physics were wrong. The nose didn't crumple. The impact was so severe and the angle so precise that the chassis suffered a catastrophic structural failure at the bulkhead, the vertical wall of carbon fiber that separates the driver's legs from the front suspension. The car didn't crush, it snapped. The entire front section of the car, the nose, the wings, the suspension, and the footwell, was sheared off instantly. It was as if a giant invisible guillotine had dropped on the car just forward of the dashboard. The energy of the impact sent the car spinning wildly into the air. It pirouetted airborne, flying over the cars of other drivers who were scattering to avoid the debris. When the car landed, it slammed back onto the asphalt belly first. But something was wrong. The silhouette was wrong. The car was too short. As the wreckage slid down the short chute between Turn 1 and Turn 2, grinding sparks against the pavement, the world saw the image that would haunt the sport forever. Television director Alamir Al-Bodnar was cutting the live feed for ABC Sports. He switched to a camera tracking the crash. On millions of screens around the world, viewers saw the purple tub of Stan Fox's car sliding to a halt. The front of the car was gone. The dashboard was the new front bumper, and protruding from the jagged, torn carbon fiber were Stan Fox's legs. They were covered in his fireproof racing suit and shoes, but they were completely exposed. There was no metal, no carbon, no structure around them. They were simply dangling in the air, flailing limply as the car shuddered to a stop. The violence of the image was primal. We are used to seeing race cars destroyed, but we are used to the driver remaining hidden within a protective cocoon. To see the human form so vulnerable, so nakedly exposed amidst the wreckage of high technology, was deeply disturbing. It looked like an autopsy performed at 200 miles per hour. Commentator Paul Page, a man who had seen everything in racing, famously hesitated. His voice dropped an octave. "Oh, terrible crash." Bobby Unser, the three-time champion in the booth, went silent. He knew what he was looking at. In the history of open-wheel racing, when the footbox is destroyed, the driver usually does not survive. The femoral arteries are severed, or the trauma to the lower body is so massive that shock kills instantly. The car came to rest against the wall. Fox slumped forward in the cockpit. His helmet hung low, chin to chest. He was motionless. Debris littered the track for hundreds of yards. The smell of methanol and pulverized carbon fiber hung heavy. The silence that fell over the speedway, a venue holding 400,000 people, was absolute. It was the silence of a crowd that believed they had just witnessed a death. Inside the cockpit, Stan Fox was traveling a journey no human should take. The telemetry data from the car later revealed the magnitude of the impact. Estimates placed the peak deceleration at somewhere between 60 and 80 Gs. To put that in perspective, a fighter pilot might pull 9 Gs in a high-speed turn. A severe car crash on the highway might generate 30 Gs. At 60 to 80 Gs, the internal organs strike the inside of the rib cage. The brain strikes the inside of the skull. The blood weighs as much as lead. The reason Fox's legs were not instantly pulverized is a matter of macabre luck. When the front of the car sheared off, the energy was expended in breaking the carbon fiber rather than crushing his legs. The nose cone took the energy and left the building. His legs were left exposed, yes, but they hadn't absorbed the direct impact of the wall. They had swung free. However, the real damage was happening higher up. When the car hit the wall and stopped abruptly, Fox's body was held in place by the 6-point safety harness. His torso stopped, but his head, weighing roughly 15 pounds with the helmet, wanted to keep moving at 200 miles per hour. This was 1995. There was no hands device. The hands device is a carbon fiber collar that tethers the helmet to the shoulders, preventing the head from snapping forward in a crash. It is mandatory today, but in 1995 it was still a prototype, viewed with skepticism by many drivers. Without a hands device, Fox's head snapped forward with ferocious violence. The strap of his helmet dug into his chin, his neck stretched. But the most catastrophic injury was happening inside the cranium. The brain is a soft, gelatinous organ floating in cerebrospinal fluid. When the skull stops instantly, the brain slams into the front of the skull, then bounces back and hits the rear of the skull. But worse is the rotational force. The brain twists on the brainstem. This shearing force tears the microscopic axons, the wiring that connects neurons. It is called diffuse axonal injury. It is one of the most devastating forms of traumatic brain injury. It doesn't necessarily show up as a giant bleed on a CT scan immediately, but it disconnects the circuitry of the mind. Stan Fox was knocked unconscious instantly. He wasn't asleep. His brain had effectively shut down the main power grid to protect itself from the surge. The whole Metro safety team at Indianapolis is the best in the world. Within seconds of the car coming to a halt, the yellow trucks were rolling. When the first medic reached the car, the sight was gruesome. Fox was slumped, unresponsive. His visor was open. His eyes were closed. "Driver is unresponsive," the radio crackled. The extraction of a driver from a compromised chassis is a delicate operation. They couldn't just pull him out. They had to assume his neck was broken. They had to assume his legs were shattered. They carefully cut the safety belts. They placed a KED board behind his back to stabilize his spine. 5 men worked in practiced unison, lifting him vertically out of the shattered tub. As they lifted him, the crowd saw his legs move. A ripple of confusion went through the stands. His legs looked intact. There was no blood soaking the suit. How was that possible? He was loaded onto the stretcher and rushed to the infield medical center, then immediately transferred to the helicopter. The Lifeline chopper lifted off, banking toward Methodist Hospital in downtown Indianapolis. Dr. Henry Bach, the Speedway's medical director, faced the media. The updates were sparse. Critical condition. Head injury. The race restarted. The other drivers, professionals to the core, pushed the image of Fox's exposed legs out of their minds and went back to racing at 220 miles per hour. Jacques Villeneuve would go on to win the race, a victory that would launch his Formula One career. But at Methodist Hospital, a different race was beginning. Stan Fox was in the neuro-intensive care unit. His brain was swelling. The pressure inside his skull was rising. Intracranial hypertension. If the pressure got too high, it would crush the brainstem and he would die. The doctors made the decision to induce a coma. They administered drugs to lower his metabolic rate, to give the brain a chance to rest, to keep the swelling down. For 5 days, Stan Fox existed in the gray zone, the medically induced twilight between life and death. While the racing world moved on, Jacques Villeneuve drank the milk, the teams packed up their transporters, and the circus moved to Milwaukee. Stan Fox lay motionless in a bed at Methodist Hospital. To the outside observer, he looked remarkably intact. This was the most baffling aspect of the crash. Fans who had seen the footage assumed his legs had been amputated or crushed. Yet miraculously, his legs were fine. He had a bruise on his heel. That was it. The carbon fiber had sheared away so cleanly that, despite his limbs flailing in the open air at 200 miles per hour, they had struck nothing solid. The violence was entirely internal. Inside his skull, a silent storm was raging. The deceleration had caused a small subdural hematoma, a blood clot forming on the surface of the brain. The surgeons had operated swiftly to remove it, but the structural damage to the neurons, the diffuse axonal injury, was the real enemy. When the brain is shaken that violently, the connections between the processing centers and the wiring are frayed. It's like a telephone exchange where the switchboard has been hit by an earthquake. The lines are still there, but the calls aren't connecting. On June 2, 1995, 5 days after the crash, the doctors began to lift the chemical veil. They reduced the sedatives. The family waited. Waking up from a severe brain injury is not like the movies. There is no sudden gasp, no dramatic sitting up in bed asking, "Did I win?" It is a slow, agonizing ascent from the depths. It is a flickering light bulb trying to stay on. When Stan Fox finally opened his eyes, he looked at his wife, Jean. He looked at Ron Hemmelgarn, his team owner. He recognized them. He could speak. "I'm thirsty," he whispered. It seemed like a triumph. He was alive. He was talking. He was Stan. The racing press reported the good news. Fox is awake. Fox is alert. The relief was palpable. The narrative was shaping up to be a classic sports comeback story. The hero falls, the hero rises, the hero returns. But as the days turned into weeks, those closest to him began to realize the terrifying truth. The man in the bed was Stan Fox, but he was also not. The recovery of the body was swift. Stan Fox was an athlete. He was physically tough. Within weeks, he was walking. He was gaining strength. He looked, for all intents and purposes, like a man who had walked away from a car crash with a few scrapes. But the mind is not a bone. It does not knit back together in a straight line. As Fox began his rehabilitation, the deficits became apparent. The old Stan, the quick-witted, sarcastic, fearless prankster, was replaced by a version of himself that was slower, softer, and profoundly confused. He had near total amnesia of the crash. This is common. The brain often deletes the trauma tape. He didn't remember the start of the race. He didn't remember turn 1. He didn't remember the helicopter ride. He woke up in June thinking it was still May. But it was more than memory. It was personality. Neurologists call it frontal lobe syndrome. The frontal lobes of the brain are the CEO of the personality. They control impulse, emotional regulation, planning, and social filters. When they are damaged, the governor is removed. Stan became emotionally volatile. He would laugh at inappropriate times or burst into tears over minor frustrations. The sharp, cynical edge that made him a racer was blunted. He became childlike in his dependence on others. He had trouble processing complex environments. A crowded room was no longer a party. It was a sensory assault of noise and light that his brain couldn't filter. One of the most heartbreaking moments came when he watched the replay of his own crash for the first time. Most drivers analyze their crashes with clinical detachment. They look at the suspension failure, the tire marks, the angle of impact. Stan watched the footage of his purple car disintegrating, his legs dangling, and he didn't analyze it. He stared at it with a mixture of horror and detachment, as if watching a stranger. "That's me?" he asked. "I did that?" He couldn't reconcile the violence on the screen with the person he felt he was. He had survived the unsurvivable, but he didn't feel like a Superman. He felt fragile. The physical recovery happened at lightning speed. By August, just 3 months after the crash, Stan felt strong. He started talking about getting back in the car. "I'll be ready for next year," he told reporters. "I'm going to race the '96 Indy 500. This is the racer's mindset. Denial is a performance-enhancing drug. You have to believe you are invincible or you can't do the job. Stan clung to the idea of returning to racing like a drowning man clinging to a raft. It was his identity. Without racing, he was just a guy from Wisconsin with a bad haircut. With racing, he was a gladiator. But the doctors knew better. Dr. Henry Bach and the neurosurgeons at Methodist Hospital monitored his progress. They tested his reaction times. They tested his cognitive processing speed. The results were brutal. While he could drive a road car, the milliseconds required to control a race car at 230 miles per hour were gone. The brain needs to process visual information, a closing gap, a sliding tire, a yellow flag, and translate it into hand and foot movements instantly. Stan's processing speed had slowed down. In everyday life, it was barely noticeable. On a racetrack, it was a death sentence. In late 1995, the conversation happened. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a verdict. "Stan, you can't race. Not IndyCars, not midgets, not anything competitive. One more hit to the head, even a minor one, could kill you or leave you in a vegetative state. It is called second impact syndrome." His brain was still healing. Another concussion would be catastrophic. The news broke Stan Fox's heart. It didn't just break it, it shattered his reality. He was 43 years old. He had spent 25 years in a cockpit. He didn't have a backup plan. He didn't have a college degree or a business empire. He had a helmet and a fire suit. To be told you are retired is one thing. To be told you are incapable is another. The years 1996 and 1997 were a descent into a new kind of hell. Stan Fox became a celebrity survivor. He was invited to tracks not to race but to wave to the crowd. He was the man who cheated death. He would sign autographs, smile for the cameras, and tell the story of the crash. But inside, he was rotting. Imagine being a virtuoso pianist who loses his hands, but is asked to come to the concert hall every night to watch others play the piano. That was Stan's life. He went to the races because it was the only world he knew, but being there was torture. He watched the formation of the Indy Racing League. He watched drivers he used to beat, guys like Buddy Lazier and Brayton, winning races and championships. He watched the sport move on without him. He began to suffer from profound depression. The adrenaline that had fueled his life for 2 decades was cut off. The withdrawal was chemical and psychological. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life. People treated him differently. They treated him with kid gloves. They spoke to him slowly. The camaraderie of the pits, the roasting, the insults, the rough love disappeared, replaced by pity. And for a proud man like Stan Fox, pity was worse than hate. He also struggled with the "why me" question. Not "why did I crash?" but "why did I survive?" In 1996, Scott Brayton, the pole sitter for the Indy 500, was killed in a practice crash. Stan knew Scott. Scott hit the wall and died instantly. Stan hit the wall harder, got cut in half, and lived. Where was the justice in that? Where was the logic? He felt like a statistical anomaly, a glitch in the matrix. He walked around with the guilt of the survivor, feeling like he had cheated a system that always balances the books eventually. The coping mechanisms began to fail. Stan had always enjoyed a beer. In the 70s and 80s, the racing culture was fueled by Miller Lite and cigarettes. But after the crash, alcohol changed from a social lubricant to an anesthetic. He drank to silence the noise in his head. He drank to numb the frustration of his slowed cognitive processes. He drank to forget that he would never feel the kick of a methanol engine again. His marriage to Jean, already strained by the pressure of the racing life, began to crumble under the weight of the brain injury and the depression. Living with a TBI survivor is incredibly difficult for spouses. The person they married is gone, replaced by someone with different emotional triggers and needs. They eventually divorced. Stan found himself alone, living in a house full of trophies that felt like artifacts from an ancient civilization. He tried to start businesses. He started Stan Fox Racing, helping to mentor young drivers. He started a tour group company, taking fans to the Indy 500. He tried to stay busy, but friends noticed the decline. He would call people late at night, rambling, repeating the same stories. He seemed lost. The survivor of the century was slowly drowning in a sea of mundane, quiet despair. This is the part of the story the highlight reels don't show. They show the crash, and then they show the miraculous wave to the crowd. They don't show the Tuesday nights alone in Wisconsin, staring at the wall, trying to remember what it felt like to be brave. Despite the darkness, there were flashes of the old grit. Stan realized that his survival gave him a platform. He became an advocate for head injury awareness. In the mid-90s, TBI was not well understood by the general public. It was the silent epidemic. Stan worked with the Head Injury Foundation. He visited hospitals. He spoke to other survivors. In these moments, he found a new tentative purpose. He would walk into a room of patients with bandaged heads and vacant stares, and he would say, "I've been there. I know it's dark, but you can wake up." He connected with people in a way he never could when he was just a racer. He wasn't a superhero anymore. He was a fellow sufferer. He was vulnerable. There is a poignant story from this era. Stan was visiting a children's hospital. A young boy, also a car accident victim with a brain injury, was struggling to walk. Stan, who still had a slight hitch in his gait from the atrophy of his recovery, walked with him. "We're a little wobbly," Stan told the kid, "but we're moving forward. That's the trick. Just keep the wheels turning." It was a noble second act, but noble acts don't cure the inner void. Stan was helping others, but he couldn't seem to help himself. He was restless. He needed to be on the move. He needed the road. By the year 2000, 5 years had passed since the crash. The new millennium had arrived. Stan Fox was 48 years old. The racing world was beginning to forget. New heroes had emerged. The crash of '95 was becoming archival footage. You got to see this Chris's clip on generic TV shows. Stan needed a getaway. He needed to be around the pure, unadulterated racing culture that birthed him. He needed to get away from the corporate stiffness of Indy. He received an invitation to go to New Zealand. New Zealand has a vibrant, passionate midget car scene. They race on dirt just like in Wisconsin. They love the old-school American outlaws. To the Kiwis, Stan Fox wasn't a broken brain injury victim. He was a legend. He was the king of the midgets. They wanted him to come down for the summer season. They wanted him to be the grand marshal. They wanted him to drive a few parade laps in a vintage car. It sounded perfect. A place where he was still the hero. A place far away from the memories of Turn 1. A place where the beer was cold and the dirt was loose. Stan accepted. He packed his bags in December 2000. He seemed optimistic. He told friends he was looking forward to the trip, looking forward to seeing some real racing again. He boarded a plane for the long flight across the Pacific, leaving the winter of Wisconsin for the summer of New Zealand. He didn't know it, but he was flying toward the closing bracket of his life. The circle that began on the dirt tracks of the Midwest was about to close on a lonely road on the other side of the world. Fate had missed him in Indianapolis, but fate is a hunter that never loses the scent. New Zealand has always held a peculiar and passionate place in the world of dirt track racing. Despite its isolation, or perhaps because of it, the Kiwi racing culture in the late 90s and early 2000s mirrored the American scene of the 1970s. It was raw, enthusiastic, and devoid of the corporate gloss that had sterilized IndyCar. At Western Springs Speedway in Auckland, a natural amphitheater carved into a volcanic cone, midget racing was religion. The fans there didn't care about telemetry or wind tunnels. They cared about courage, noise, and the slide. To them, Stan Fox wasn't the brain-damaged survivor of a horrifying crash. He was royalty. He was the American invader who had conquered Belleville. He was the legend. For Fox, this reception was a narcotic. For 5 years, he had lived in the shadow of his own broken body, treated with the pity reserved for invalids. In Wisconsin, he was poor Stan. In Auckland, he was Stan the man. The psychological shift was immediate. Witnesses who spent time with him during those first few days in New Zealand described a man who seemed lighter, as if the gravity of his depression had been slightly reduced by the Southern Hemisphere's pull. He smiled more. The twitchy, erratic behavior that plagued him at home seemed to smooth out amidst the adoration of the Kiwi fans who lined up for his autograph, holding old programs and faded photographs from 20 years prior. He traveled with an entourage of friends and racing associates moving through the North Island like a visiting dignitary. He attended race meetings, not as a competitor, but as an ambassador. He waved to the crowds, soaked in the applause, and for a brief moment, the silence that had haunted him since 1995 was drowned out by the familiar, comforting roar of methanol engines. It was a victory lap for a race that had ended years ago. He was surrounded by the tribe of speed, the only community he had ever truly understood. However, beneath the surface of this triumphant tour, the restless energy of the head injury remained. Stan was known to be impulsive, a trait exacerbated by the frontal lobe damage. He had difficulty sitting still. He needed to be moving. The itinerary was packed, but Stan often operated on his own internal clock, a clock that had been out of sync with the rest of the world since Turn 1. On December 18, 2000, the schedule called for a movement south. Stan and his group were traveling from the racing hubs of the north down towards Wellington, the capital city on the southern tip of the North Island. It was a journey of roughly 650 kilometers, traversing the spine of the country. New Zealand's geography is deceptively rugged. It is not a land of wide, forgiving interstates like the American Midwest. The roads are narrow, two-lane ribbons of asphalt that wind through mountain ranges, volcanic plateaus, and dense forests. They demand attention. They are beautiful, but they are unforgiving. Stan was behind the wheel of a light white van. It was a standard utilitarian vehicle, a box on wheels with a high center of gravity, thin metal doors, and absolutely none of the safety cages he had spent his life strapped into. It was a vehicle designed for delivering parcels, not for surviving impacts. In a cruel twist of fate, the man who had survived inside a $1 million carbon fiber monocoque was now driving one of the least safe vehicles on the road. He was driving alone in the van, following friends who were in other vehicles. The solitude of the drive likely appealed to him at first. The road trip is an American tradition, a time for reflection. But as the sun set and the darkness of the New Zealand wilderness closed in, that solitude would turn into a liability. The route took them onto State Highway 1, specifically the section known as the Desert Road. The Desert Road is an anomaly in New Zealand's lush landscape. It cuts across the Rangipo Desert, a barren volcanic plateau that sits in the shadow of 3 active volcanoes, Tongariro, Nguruho, and Ruapehu. It is a place of stark alien beauty. The altitude is high, the weather is unpredictable, and the landscape is dominated by tussock grass, black volcanic rock, and emptiness. There are no streetlights on the desert road. When night falls, it is absolute. The darkness is total, broken only by the cones of headlights cutting through the gloom. It is a lonely, desolate stretch of tarmac that feels disconnected from civilization. The wind howls across the plateau, buffeting high-sided vehicles. It is a road that requires constant micro-corrections, constant vigilance. For a driver with a normal brain, the desert road at night is fatiguing. For a driver with a traumatic brain injury whose processing speeds are slowed, whose ability to judge closing distances in low light is compromised, it was a gauntlet. It was late. The convoy was pushing south. Fatigue, the silent killer of drivers everywhere, was undoubtedly setting in. Stan Fox had been on for days, socializing, traveling, performing the role of the hero. His cognitive reserves were likely depleted. The brain injury meant that his battery drained faster than a normal person's. When the brain is tired, the first things to go are spatial awareness and reaction time, the very tools he needed to keep the white van in its lane. Around 320 kilometers south of Auckland, deep in the heart of the volcanic plateau, the physics of disaster began to align. A large truck and trailer unit was traveling north. These are massive rigs, the lifeblood of New Zealand's freight network. On a narrow 2-lane road, the closing speed between a southbound van and a northbound truck is over 200 kilometers per hour. The margin for error is measured in inches. There were no witnesses to the specific internal moment of failure. We do not know if Stan fell asleep. We do not know if he was distracted by a radio or a thought or a phantom memory. We do not know if he simply misjudged the curvature of the road in the pitch blackness. What we do know, from the police reports and the tire marks, is that the white van drifted. It did not spin. It did not blow a tire. It simply crossed the center line. It was a gradual, almost lazy drift into the opposing lane. It was the movement of a driver who is disconnected from the task at hand. In racing, Stan Fox was famous for his lightning-fast hands, his ability to catch a slide before the spectators even saw it. But here, on this dark highway, there was no correction. The internal gyroscope that had saved him 1,000 times on the dirt tracks was silent. The driver of the oncoming truck had no time to react. The headlights of the van appeared in his lane, blinding and immediate. The impact was catastrophic. At Indianapolis in 1995, Stan Fox hit the wall at a shallow angle with a car designed to shed energy. The nose cone flew off. The wheels flew off. The energy was dispersed. On the desert road, the collision was head-on. The flat front of the white van met the flat steel grille of the heavy truck. There was no deflection. There was no spin to dissipate the energy. The kinetic energy was absorbed entirely by the crumple zone of the van, which was virtually non-existent. The steering column, the dashboard, the engine block, they were all pushed backwards into the driver's space. Stan Fox was not wearing a 5-point racing harness. He was not wearing a helmet. He was wearing casual clothes. Reports indicate he may not even have been wearing the standard 3-point seatbelt, though at those forces it is unlikely to have made a difference. The irony is sickening. In 1995, he survived 80 Gs because the car sacrificed itself to save him. In 2000, he died in a collision of perhaps 40 or 50 Gs because the vehicle collapsed onto him. The violence was over in a fraction of a second. The van was destroyed. The truck jackknifed, skidding to a halt on the desolate highway. Silence returned to the desert road, broken only by the hiss of steam from ruptured radiators and the wind whistling through the tussock grass. There were no cheering crowds. There was no global television audience gasping in horror. There was just the cold night air of the volcanic plateau and the twisted metal of a delivery van. Stan Fox, the man who had defied the Reaper in the most spectacular arena on Earth, lay dead in the darkness, half a world away from home. The friends traveling in the convoy realized Stan was missing. They turned back. The discovery of the crash site was a scene of trauma that rivaled anything seen on a racetrack, but without the sterile professionalism of a safety team. This was raw, roadside horror. When the emergency services arrived, volunteer firefighters from small nearby towns, local police officers, they found a scene of total devastation. They didn't know who the man in the van was. They didn't know he was a legend. They didn't know that the legs trapped in the wreckage were the same legs that had dangled famously over the Indianapolis asphalt 5 years prior. To them, he was just another fatality on a dangerous road, another statistic in the holiday road toll. It took time for the news to travel. The time difference between New Zealand and the United States meant that while Stan lay dead on the side of the road, his friends and family in Wisconsin were sleeping, unaware that the final chapter had been written. When the identification was made, the shock was distinct. It wasn't the shock of a race driver dying in a race car. The racing community is inoculated against that. They understand that risk. If Stan had died at Indianapolis in '95, it would have been tragic, but logical. It would have fit the narrative. But this made no sense. This was a glitch in the script. To survive the fire, only to die in the cold? To survive the speed of sound, only to die at the speed limit? It felt like a cosmic joke, a cruel balancing of the books by a universe that refused to let him get away with it. The news trickled out slowly. In the pre-social media era of 2000, it moved via phone calls and fax machines. Stan Fox is dead. Car crash. Yes. Which track? No track, a highway in New Zealand. The confusion was universal. People couldn't process it. It was similar to the death of Mike Hawthorne, the Britain's first Formula One champion, who retired from the sport after seeing his friend die, only to crash his Jaguar on a public road months later. It highlighted the absurdity of life. In Janesville, Wisconsin, the flags were lowered. The bars where Stan used to drink fell silent. The racing shops where his old midget cars sat gathering dust became impromptu shrines. But amidst the grief, there was a strange, uncomfortable sense of closure. For 5 years, Stan Fox had been a ghost. He had been a man suspended between two worlds, unable to race, but unable to find peace in normal life. He had been suffering. The brain injury had trapped him in a maze of confusion and depression from which there was no exit. In a dark, complicated way, the desert road had set him free. The engine finally stopped. The struggle to process a world that moved too fast for his damaged brain was over. Stan Fox should not be remembered as a victim of a van crash, nor should he be remembered solely as the legs dangling from a broken Renard at Indy. He should be remembered as the gas man. The kid from Wisconsin with the flat-top haircut who sat in a 900-pound midget car and drove it deeper into the corner than anyone else dared. He should be remembered for the cigarette hanging out of his mouth in the pits, the dirt caked on his face, and the fearless, reckless joy he found in going fast. His life was a paradox. He lived by the sword of speed, was broken by it, and was ultimately finished by the lack of it. In the end, Stan Fox's story isn't a tragedy of death. It's a testament to the sheer, stubborn will of life. He cheated the Reaper in 1995. He bought himself 5 more years of sunsets, 5 more years of seeing his friends, 5 more years of breathing air he wasn't supposed to breathe. He didn't lose the race against death. No one wins that race. But Stan Fox made death work harder for him than almost anyone else in history. And in the world of racing, that is the only victory that counts.